I never thought a wheelchair would be the thing that destroyed our neighborhood's homeowner association. But that's exactly what happened on a scorching July afternoon in Phoenix, Arizona. My son Thomas had just turned 8 years old, and all he wanted was to swim in the community pool like every other kid in our subdivision of Desert Springs Estates. The problem was that Thomas had been using a specialized wheelchair since he was 4, after a car accident left him with limited mobility in his lower body. The chair wasn't some clunky hospital equipment either. It was a sleek, modern mobility device that cost us nearly $15,000, and it was as much a part of Thomas as his arms or legs. I'm Isaac Donovan, and I'd lived in Desert Springs Estates for 6 years. My wife, Natalie Carson, and I had moved there when Thomas was 2, drawn by the promised amenities and the good schools nearby. The subdivision had everything: manicured lawns, a state-of-the-art fitness center, tennis courts, and a beautiful Olympic-sized pool that sparkled like a turquoise gem in the Arizona sun. The HOA fees were steep at $400 a month, but we figured it was worth it for the lifestyle and the sense of community. That particular day started like any other summer Saturday. Thomas had been begging me all week to take him swimming, and I'd finally cleared my schedule. I worked as a software engineer for a tech company downtown, and Natalie was a nurse at Phoenix Memorial Hospital, currently on a day shift. So it was just me and Thomas, ready for some father-son bonding time at the pool. We arrived at the pool area around 2 in the afternoon. Thomas was excited, bouncing in his wheelchair as much as his condition allowed. I'd brought his swimming trunks, sunscreen, floaties, and everything else we needed. The pool area was moderately crowded with families enjoying the weekend. Kids splashed in the shallow end while parents lounged on deck chairs, and the smell of chlorine mixed with coconut sunscreen filled the air. I pushed Thomas through the gate, and that's when I heard the voice. "Excuse me. Excuse me, sir." I turned to see a woman in her late 40s marching toward us, with the determination of a general leading troops into battle. She had blonde hair cut in that particular style that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager," and she wore a white visor, designer sunglasses, and a look of absolute indignation on her face. I recognized her immediately as Patricia Whitmore, the HOA president and the most notorious busybody in Desert Springs Estates. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice polite. "Yes, you certainly can," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm afraid you cannot bring that motorized vehicle into the pool area. It's clearly stated in Section 12, Paragraph 4 of our HOA regulations." I stared at her, genuinely confused. "Motorized vehicle? You mean my son's wheelchair?" "It's a safety hazard," Patricia insisted, crossing her arms. "What if it malfunctions near the water? What if a child trips over it? We have liability concerns." Thomas's excited expression had already started to fade, replaced by that look of hurt and confusion that no parent ever wants to see on their child's face. He understood exactly what was happening, even at 8 years old. He'd faced this kind of discrimination before, but never in our own neighborhood, never in a place we called home. "This is his wheelchair," I said, my voice getting harder. "He needs it to get around. You can't seriously expect him to just not come to the pool." "I'm not saying he can't come," Patricia said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I'm saying the wheelchair cannot enter the pool deck area. Perhaps you could carry him to a chair and leave the wheelchair outside the gate." "That's ridiculous," I said. "How is he supposed to move around?" "Use the bathroom. This wheelchair is medical equipment." "I don't make the rules," Patricia said with a shrug that was anything but apologetic. "I just enforce them. The regulations clearly state no motorized vehicles on the pool deck. That includes motorized wheelchairs, scooters, or any similar device. Other pool goers had started to notice the commotion. Some looked away uncomfortably, while others watched with open curiosity. I felt my face getting hot, and not from the Arizona sun. "Dad, it's okay," Thomas said quietly. "We can just go home." That broke my heart. The defeat in his voice, the acceptance of exclusion as if it were normal. No kid should have to feel that way, especially not in their own neighborhood. "No," I said firmly, looking at Patricia. "This is discrimination against people with disabilities. You're violating the Americans with Disabilities Act." Patricia's expression hardened. "Don't threaten me with legal jargon, Mr. Donovan. I have the authority of the HOA board behind me. If you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to call security and have you removed from the premises." "Call them," I said. "I'd love to explain this situation to someone else." Patricia's face turned red, but she pulled out her phone and made a call. Within 5 minutes, a bored-looking security guard named Miguel showed up. He was a young guy, maybe 25, who clearly didn't want to be in the middle of this situation. "What's the problem here?" Miguel asked. Patricia jumped in before I could speak. "This resident is refusing to comply with HOA regulations regarding motorized vehicles in the pool area." Miguel looked at Thomas in his wheelchair, then at Patricia, then back at the wheelchair. "Madam, that's a kid's wheelchair. It's motorized," Patricia insisted. "The rules are clear." Miguel scratched his head. "I don't know, madam. This seems like something you should take up with the board, not a security issue. Are you refusing to do your job?" Patricia's voice rose an octave. "I'm saying I'm not going to kick out a disabled kid from the pool," Miguel said flatly. "That's not in my job description." I could have hugged the guy right then. Patricia looked like she was about to explode, her face turning from red to purple. "Fine," she spat. "You can stay today, Mr. Donovan, but this matter will be brought before the full HOA board. Expect consequences." She stormed off, her white visor bobbing with each angry step. Miguel gave me an apologetic shrug and walked away. The other pool goers gradually returned to their activities, though I caught more than a few sympathetic looks. "Can we still swim, Dad?" Thomas asked, his voice small. "Absolutely," I said, forcing a smile. "That's why we came here, buddy. We had a good afternoon, all things considered. Thomas loved the water, and I made sure he had the time of his life." But the encounter with Patricia had cast a shadow over the day, and I couldn't shake the anger bubbling in my chest. That evening, after putting Thomas to bed, I told Natalie everything. She was livid. "They can't do that," she said, pacing our living room. "That's blatant disability discrimination." "That's what I said," I replied, "but Patricia doesn't seem to care." "We need to fight this," Natalie said. "Not just for Thomas, but for every person with a disability in this community." I agreed completely, but I had no idea just how ugly things were about to get. 3 days later, we received a formal letter from the Desert Springs Estates HOA. It was typed on official letterboard with the HOA logo at the top, signed by Patricia Whitmore and the other 4 board members. The letter informed us that we were in violation of multiple HOA regulations, specifically Section 12, Paragraph 4 regarding motorized vehicles on recreational property. We were being fined $500 and warned that continued violations would result in additional fines and potential legal action. The letter also helpfully included a copy of the regulation in question. It read, "No motorized vehicles including but not limited to golf carts, scooters, motorcycles, or similar devices shall be permitted on pool deck areas, tennis courts, or other recreational facilities within the community." I read the regulation 3 times, my blood pressure rising with each pass. The language was clearly intended to prevent people from driving golf carts onto the pool deck, not to ban wheelchairs used by people with disabilities. "This is insane," Natalie said, reading over my shoulder. "They're interpreting this regulation in the worst possible way." "Deliberately," I added. "Patricia knows exactly what she's doing." I decided to respond in writing first, before escalating further. I drafted a careful letter explaining that wheelchairs are medical devices, not vehicles, and that the ADA requires reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. I cited specific sections of the ADA and Arizona state accessibility laws. I sent the letter via certified mail to ensure they couldn't claim they never received it. The response came 5 days later. Another formal letter, this time even more condescending in tone. The board stated that they had consulted with their legal counsel and believed their interpretation of the regulations was correct. They claimed that allowing motorized wheelchairs would set a precedent for other motorized devices, creating an unmanageable situation. They doubled the fine to $1,000 and stated that Thomas would not be permitted in the pool area until the matter was resolved. "Legal counsel," Natalie said bitterly. "They actually paid a lawyer to help them discriminate against our son." I was beyond angry now. I was determined. The next morning, I contacted the Arizona Center for Disability Law, a nonprofit organization that provides legal assistance to people with disabilities facing discrimination. I spoke with an attorney named Robert Chen, who listened to my story with growing interest. "This is a clear ADA violation," Robert said. "The law is very specific about reasonable accommodations, and access to community amenities definitely falls under that umbrella." "So we can fight this?" I asked. "Absolutely," Robert confirmed. "I'd recommend sending them one more formal demand letter, outlining the legal violations and giving them a chance to correct the situation. If they refuse, we file suit." "How long does something like this take?" I asked. "It varies," Robert said. "Could be months, could be over a year. But cases like these often settle before trial once the HOA realizes how much trouble they're in." Robert helped me draft a demand letter that was far more legally sophisticated than my previous attempt. It cited specific ADA provisions, referenced case law, and made it crystal clear that the HOA's actions constituted illegal discrimination. The letter demanded that the HOA immediately rescind all fines, allow Thomas full access to all community amenities, and provide written assurance that no future discrimination would occur. We sent the letter on a Monday. By Thursday, we had a response. The HOA board had scheduled an emergency meeting for the following Tuesday evening, and all residents were invited to attend. The agenda included discussion of accessibility policies and procedures. It was clear that Patricia and the board planned to make this a public spectacle rather than quietly backing down. "They want to rally the neighbors against us," Natalie said. "Or they want to put pressure on us to drop it," I replied. "Either way, we're going to that meeting." The meeting was held in the community center, a sprawling building that also housed the fitness center and game rooms. By the time Natalie and I arrived with Thomas, the meeting room was packed. It seemed like half the neighborhood had shown up, drawn by the promise of drama. The room was set up with rows of folding chairs facing a long table, where the 5 board members sat like judges. Patricia sat in the center, flanked by the other board members. Donald Reeves, a retired accountant, Susan Martinez, a real estate agent, Gregory Thompson, who owned a local car dealership, and Linda Wu, a stay-at-home mom who seemed perpetually nervous. Patricia called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel, clearly enjoying her moment of authority. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "We're here tonight to discuss an important matter affecting our community. As many of you know, we've had a disagreement with one of our residents regarding pool access." She made it sound so neutral, so reasonable. No mention of discrimination or the fact that we were talking about an 8-year-old boy. "The HOA board takes its responsibilities very seriously," Patricia continued. "Our primary duty is to maintain property values and ensure the safety and enjoyment of all residents. Sometimes that means making difficult decisions and enforcing regulations that may be unpopular." I raised my hand. Patricia pretended not to see me. "The specific issue at hand involves motorized wheelchairs in the pool area," Patricia said. "Now, we're all sympathetic to people with disabilities. That but was coming, I could feel it, but we also have to think about liability. What happens if someone trips over the wheelchair? What if it malfunctions and goes into the pool? What if other residents start bringing in their own motorized devices, claiming they need them? Where do we draw the line?" "This is unbelievable," Natalie whispered beside me. I stood up without waiting to be called on. "Can I respond to that?" Patricia looked annoyed but nodded. "Mr. Donovan, please keep your comments brief." "What you're describing isn't a safety concern," I said, my voice carrying across the room. "It's discrimination. My son Thomas has a disability. He uses a wheelchair. Federal law, specifically the Americans with Disabilities Act, requires that people with disabilities have equal access to public accommodations, and that includes HOA amenities. You're violating federal law." Several people in the audience murmured in agreement. I saw heads nodding. Patricia's expression tightened. "We've consulted with our attorney, Mr. Donovan, and we believe our position is legally sound." "Then your attorney is either incompetent or lying to you," I said bluntly. "I've consulted with the Arizona Center for Disability Law, and they've confirmed that what you're doing is illegal. I've sent you a demand letter outlining the specific violations. This isn't a gray area. You're breaking the law." Donald Reeves, the retired accountant, leaned forward. "What about our insurance concerns? If someone gets hurt because of the wheelchair, the HOA could be liable." "That's a red herring," I replied. "Wheelchairs don't pose any greater risk than any other pool furniture or equipment, and insurance concerns don't override federal civil rights law. You can't discriminate against someone because you're worried about insurance." Susan Martinez spoke up next. "What if we offered a compromise? Perhaps designated hours when wheelchairs would be allowed." "Separate but equal isn't equal," Natalie said, standing beside me. "You can't tell my son he can only swim at certain times because of his disability. That's still discrimination." Gregory Thompson, the car dealer, tried a different angle. "Look, nobody wants to discriminate, but we have rules here for a reason. If we start making exceptions, the whole system falls apart." "Reasonable accommodations aren't exceptions," I said. "They're requirements under federal law, and frankly, allowing a wheelchair isn't even that unusual of an accommodation. Wheelchairs are allowed in pools across the country every single day." Patricia rapped her gavel. "This discussion is getting circular. Let's open the floor to other residents." What followed was a mixed bag of opinions that revealed exactly who our neighbors really were. Some people spoke up in support of Thomas, sharing their own experiences with disability or expressing disgust at the HOA's position. One woman named Jennifer talked about her brother, who used a wheelchair, and how important pool access had been for his quality of life. But others sided with the HOA, parroting Patricia's talking points about liability and slippery slopes. One particularly unpleasant man named Brad argued that people with special needs should live in facilities designed for them, rather than regular neighborhoods. The comment drew gasps and angry responses from several attendees, but Brad seemed oblivious to how offensive he was being through it all. Thomas sat quietly beside us. He was too young to fully understand all the legal arguments, but he understood that people were arguing about whether he belonged. I could see him shrinking into his wheelchair, trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable. It made me want to scream. After nearly 2 hours of debate, Patricia called for a vote. The board would decide whether to modify the policy to allow wheelchairs or maintain the current interpretation. The vote was 4-1 to maintain the policy. Only Linda Wu voted against, looking miserable as she did so. "The board has spoken," Patricia announced. "Our position stands. Mr. and Mrs. Donovan, you remain in violation of HOA regulations. The fines will continue to accumulate at $100 per day until compliance is achieved." $100 per day. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're fining us $100 a day because our son has a wheelchair. We're fining you for refusing to comply with community regulations," Patricia corrected primly. "You have options. You can carry your son into the pool area without the wheelchair, or you can choose not to use the pool." "Those aren't options," Natalie said, her voice shaking with rage. "Those are insults." We left the meeting knowing exactly what we had to do. The HOA had made their position clear, and now we would make ours equally clear. The next morning, I called Robert Chen and told him everything. He was shocked by the $100 daily fine. "That's punitive and excessive," Robert said. "They're basically trying to financially coerce you into compliance. That actually strengthens our case." "So we're filing suit?" I asked. "Absolutely," Robert confirmed. "I'll start drafting the complaint today." The lawsuit was filed in the United States District Court for the District of Arizona 2 weeks later. We were suing the Desert Springs Estates Homeowners Association and the individual board members for violating the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act. We sought injunctive relief to force the HOA to change their policy, compensatory damages for emotional distress and the discriminatory treatment Thomas had suffered, and punitive damages to punish the HOA for their willful violation of federal law. We also asked the court for a preliminary injunction that would allow Thomas to use the pool immediately while the case proceeded. Robert argued that Thomas was suffering irreparable harm by being excluded from the pool during the hot Arizona summer, and that the law was clearly on our side. The HOA hired a law firm from Scottsdale to defend them. Their attorney was a slick corporate lawyer named Martin Sheffield, who specialized in HOA defense. At the preliminary injunction hearing, Martin argued that the HOA had legitimate safety concerns and that we were trying to bully them into changing reasonable regulations. Judge Elizabeth Morrison, a no-nonsense federal judge who had served on the bench for 15 years, was not impressed. "Counsel," she said, peering over her glasses at Martin, "are you seriously arguing that an 8-year-old boy in a wheelchair poses a safety risk to a pool?" "Your Honor, it's not about this specific child," Martin stammered. "It's about the precedent and the potential liability." "The precedent of following federal law?" Judge Morrison asked dryly. "The ADA has been in effect for over 30 years, Mr. Sheffield. Wheelchairs in pool areas are not novel issues. Do you have any case law supporting your position?" Martin fumbled through his papers. "We're still researching the specific parameters, Your Honor." "I see," Judge Morrison said. "Mr. Chen, I assume you have case law supporting your position." Robert stood smoothly. "Extensive case law, Your Honor. The principle is well established. Public accommodations must provide reasonable access to people with disabilities, and courts have consistently held that HOA amenities fall under that requirement. Judge Morrison granted our preliminary injunction on the spot. The HOA was ordered to immediately allow Thomas full access to all community amenities, including the pool, with his wheelchair. The judge also temporarily suspended all fines pending the outcome of the case. It was a huge victory, but we knew it was just the beginning. The next few months were a blur of legal motions, discovery requests, and depositions. The HOA showed no signs of backing down, despite their lawyers' clear unease about their position. Patricia Whitmore gave a deposition that was, according to Robert, catastrophically bad for their case. She repeatedly made statements that demonstrated animus toward people with disabilities and a fundamental misunderstanding of federal law. At one point in her deposition, Patricia actually said, "I don't think it's fair that some people get special treatment just because they are handicapped." The court reporter's eyes went wide as she typed those words. The HOA's insurance company eventually got wind of the case and was reportedly furious. They had sent a representative to meet with the board, and according to neighborhood gossip, there had been a lot of shouting. The insurance company knew exactly how much trouble the HOA was in and wanted them to settle immediately. But Patricia refused. She had dug in her heels, convinced that she was defending the neighborhood against what she called frivolous legal attacks. She sent out a newsletter to all residents, painting Natalie and me as troublemakers trying to impose our will on the community. Some of our neighbors stopped talking to us. Others left supportive notes on our door. The division in the neighborhood was painful, but we kept pushing forward. Discovery revealed some damning information. We learned that the HOA's own attorney had warned them before the pool incident that their interpretation of the motorized vehicle policy could violate the ADA. Patricia had received a memo explicitly stating that wheelchairs should be treated differently from recreational vehicles. She had ignored it. We also discovered that another resident with a disability, an elderly man named Harold who used a mobility scooter, had been quietly banned from using the community walking trails. Harold hadn't fought it because he didn't want the hassle, but his situation demonstrated a pattern of discrimination. Robert added Harold as a plaintiff, strengthening our case even further. The trial was scheduled for June, nearly 11 months after the initial pool incident. As the trial date approached, the HOA's legal position grew increasingly desperate. Martin Sheffield filed motion after motion, all of which were denied. He tried to argue that HOAs weren't subject to the ADA, that the regulations were applied neutrally without discriminatory intent, and that the fines were appropriate enforcement mechanisms. Judge Morrison rejected every argument. 2 weeks before trial, Martin finally convinced the HOA board to discuss settlement. Robert and I met with Martin, Patricia, and Donald Reeves in a conference room at Martin's law firm. Patricia looked like she'd been sucking on lemons. Donald just looked tired. "My clients are willing to offer $50,000 to settle this matter," Martin began. Robert laughed. "50,000? Your clients are facing significant damages, attorney's fees, and punitive damages. We've documented months of deliberate discrimination, willful violations of federal law, and continued harassment through excessive fines. $50,000 doesn't even cover our attorney's fees." "What number do you have in mind?" Martin asked carefully. $250,000, Robert said. "Plus immediate policy changes, anti-discrimination training for all board members, and the installation of accessible features throughout the community." Patricia's face went red. "That's outrageous." "That's consequence," Robert replied coolly. "You've violated federal law, Miss Whitmore. You've discriminated against a disabled child. You've caused emotional distress to an entire family, and you've done it all willfully, despite being warned by your own attorney that you were breaking the law. $250,000 is actually quite reasonable considering what a jury might award. We'll take our chances at trial, Patricia snapped. Martin looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Patricia, perhaps we should discuss this. There's nothing to discuss, Patricia said. We're not paying that kind of money to these people. The meeting ended with no settlement. Robert was philosophical about it. Sometimes HOAs need to learn the hard way, he said. And frankly, I think a public trial will send an important message about disability rights. The trial began on a Monday morning in June. The courthouse in downtown Phoenix was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the heat outside. Judge Morrison presided with her usual no-nonsense efficiency. Robert's opening statement was clear and powerful. He outlined the basic facts of the case, the HOA's violation of federal law, and the harm caused to Thomas and Harold. He introduced the jury to Thomas, who was sitting in the front row in his wheelchair, and explained how the HOA's actions had made him feel unwelcome in his own neighborhood. Martin's opening statement tried to paint the HOA as a well-meaning organization trying to balance competing interests. He argued that the board members were volunteers doing their best to serve the community, and that their concerns about safety and liability were legitimate, even if their execution was flawed. The jury, composed of 8 people ranging from a retired teacher to a young engineer, listened attentively. Over the next week, Robert presented our case. He called me to the stand first, and I described the pool incident, the hostile HOA meeting, and the impact on our family. I talked about watching Thomas's excitement turn to hurt, about the sleepless nights worrying about the mounting fines, and about feeling like outcasts in our own neighborhood. Natalie testified about the medical necessity of Thomas's wheelchair and the importance of pool access for children with mobility issues. She explained how swimming provided Thomas with exercise and independence that were crucial for his development. Thomas himself didn't testify, he was too young, but Robert played a video deposition where Thomas answered simple questions about how he felt when he couldn't swim with the other kids. His quiet, matter-of-fact responses about being different and not wanted were devastating. Harold testified about being banned from the walking trails, painting a picture of systematic discrimination against residents with disabilities. We also called an expert witness, a professor of disability law who explained the ADA requirements in detail, and testified that the HOA's actions were clear violations. Another expert, a pool safety consultant, testified that wheelchairs posed no unusual safety risks in pool areas. The most damaging testimony came when Robert called Patricia Whitmore to the stand. Under cross-examination, Patricia was defensive and combative. When Robert asked her about the attorney's memo warning her about ADA compliance, she dismissed it as overly cautious legal advice. So when your own attorney warned you that you might be violating federal law, you ignored that warning? Robert asked. I made a judgment call based on what I thought was best for the community, Patricia said stiffly. And that judgment call involved banning a disabled child from the pool. It involved enforcing our regulations fairly and consistently. But you don't enforce them fairly, do you? Robert produced a photograph. This is a photo from last summer showing a motorized cooler on the pool deck. Do you see that? Patricia squinted at the photo. That's different. How is it different? It's a motorized vehicle on the pool deck. It's just a cooler. It's not the same as a wheelchair. So motorized coolers are fine, but motorized wheelchairs used by disabled children are banned. Is that your position? Patricia floundered. realizing too late that she'd walked into a trap. "That's not what I mean." Robert pressed on, highlighting contradiction after contradiction in Patricia's testimony. By the time she left the stand, her credibility was in tatters. Martin tried to rehabilitate the HOA's case by calling board members who expressed sympathy for Thomas, while insisting they were just trying to follow the rules. But their testimony rang hollow, especially after Robert revealed during cross-examination that none of them had bothered to research ADA requirements before voting to ban Thomas from the pool. The closing arguments were powerful on both sides. Robert summarized the evidence and reminded the jury that federal law existed specifically to protect people like Thomas from exactly this kind of discrimination. He asked them to send a clear message that disability discrimination would not be tolerated. Martin made an emotional plea about volunteer board members doing their best in a difficult situation, arguing that they shouldn't be punished for making an honest mistake. Judge Morrison instructed the jury on the law, making it clear that good intentions were not a defense to violating the ADA. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreperson announced that they had found in favor of the plaintiffs on all counts. The HOA had violated the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act. The jury awarded $50,000 in compensatory damages to us and $20,000 to Harold for the emotional distress and discriminatory treatment they'd suffered. But the real bombshell came next. The jury awarded $180,000 in punitive damages, bringing the total to $250,000, exactly what we'd asked for in the settlement negotiations. Judge Morrison thanked the jury and scheduled a hearing for the following week to address injunctive relief and attorney's fees. Patricia sat stone-faced as the verdict was read, but I saw Donald Reeves drop his head into his hands. At the following week's hearing, Judge Morrison issued a comprehensive injunction. The HOA was ordered to immediately revise all policies to comply with federal disability law, provide anti-discrimination training to all board members and committee chairs, install additional accessible features throughout the community, including accessible parking and pool lifts, and establish a clear procedure for residents to request reasonable accommodations for disabilities. The judge also awarded Robert's firm an additional $70,000 in attorney's fees, bringing the total cost to the HOA to $320,000. "Let me be clear," Judge Morrison said from the bench. "This case should never have been necessary. The law has been clear for decades. People with disabilities have the right to equal access to housing and community amenities. The actions of this HOA board were not just legally wrong, they were morally wrong. An 8-year-old boy should never have been made to feel unwelcome because he uses a wheelchair. I hope this verdict sends a message to HOA boards across this state and this country that disability discrimination will not be tolerated and will be punished severely." The ruling made local news, then state news, then got picked up by national media. We did several interviews, and Robert used the attention to educate people about disability rights and HOA obligations. The case became a cautionary tale in HOA management circles. The financial impact on the Desert Springs Estates HOA was severe. The $320,000 judgment, plus their own legal fees, had depleted the HOA's reserves. They had to levy a special assessment of $1,500 per household to cover the costs. Many residents were furious, and a recall election was organized. Patricia Whitmore, Donald Reeves, and Susan Martinez were all voted out in the recall election 2 months later. Gregory Thompson and Linda Wu kept their positions, with Linda becoming the new president. The new board immediately implemented all of Judge Morrison's orders and actually went beyond the minimum requirements. They brought in consultants to audit every policy for potential accessibility issues, created an accessibility committee that included residents with disabilities, and made a genuine effort to be welcoming to all residents. Patricia didn't take the loss well. She became increasingly erratic in the months following the verdict, sending angry emails to neighbors and showing up at HOA meetings to rant about how she'd been treated unfairly. At one meeting, she actually tried to physically block Thomas from entering the community center, screaming that he was ruining the neighborhood. That's when things crossed from civil matter into criminal matter. Natalie and I were with Thomas, about to enter the community center for a movie night event. Patricia appeared out of nowhere, positioned herself in front of Thomas's wheelchair, and refused to move. "You don't belong here," Patricia hissed. "You and your lawsuit destroyed this community." "Patricia, move out of the way," I said firmly. "You're blocking my son." "Good," she said. "Maybe if I'd done this from the beginning, none of this would have happened." Thomas looked scared. Natalie pulled out her phone and started recording. "Patricia, you're blocking a disabled child from accessing a community facility," Natalie said clearly, making sure the phone captured everything. "This is harassment and possibly assault." "I'll do what I want," Patricia said. "I've already lost everything because of you people." Linda Wu, the new HOA president, came running out of the community center. "Patricia, what are you doing, defending our neighborhood?" Patricia said, her voice getting louder and more unhinged. "Defending our property values and our way of life from these people who think they can demand special treatment." "Patricia, you need to leave right now," Linda said. "If you don't, I'm calling the police." "Call them," Patricia shouted. "I'm not moving." Linda did exactly that. The Phoenix Police Department arrived within 10 minutes. 2 officers, a male officer named Rodriguez and a female officer named Chen, assessed the situation quickly. By then, several other residents had come out to see what was happening, and multiple people were recording on their phones. Officer Rodriguez spoke to Patricia first, trying to calm her down and get her to move. She refused, launching into a rambling tirade about the lawsuit and how we destroyed her life. "Madam, you need to step aside," Officer Rodriguez said patiently. "You're blocking access to a public accommodation." "It's not public, it's private," Patricia insisted. "This is an HOA community. It's still open to all residents, and you're intentionally blocking a disabled child," Officer Chen said. "That's not okay." Patricia still refused to move. Finally, Officer Rodriguez had no choice. "Madam, I'm placing you under arrest for disorderly conduct and harassment." Patricia's eyes went wide. "You can't arrest me, I live here." "You're intentionally creating a public disturbance and harassing a child," Officer Rodriguez said calmly, taking out his handcuffs. "Please turn around and put your hands behind your back." Patricia tried to run. She actually tried to push past Officer Chen and flee. That added resisting arrest to her charges. The 2 officers subdued her quickly and professionally, though Patricia screamed and struggled the entire time. As they led her to the patrol car, Patricia shouted at us, "This is your fault. All of this is your fault. I hope you're happy." Thomas was crying now, overwhelmed by the scene. Natalie and I took him home immediately, skipping the movie night. The incident resulted in Patricia being charged with disorderly conduct, harassment, and resisting arrest. She was released on bail the next day, but was immediately served with a restraining order requiring her to stay at least 500 feet away from our family. Patricia's husband, a quiet man named Gerald who worked in pharmaceutical sales, filed for divorce 2 weeks later. According to neighborhood gossip, He'd been appalled by his wife's behavior and the financial ruin it had brought to their family. The stress of the lawsuit, the judgment, and now criminal charges had destroyed their marriage. The criminal case proceeded quickly. Patricia's attorney tried to argue that she'd been having a mental health crisis, but the prosecution pointed out that she'd had numerous opportunities to walk away and had instead chosen to escalate. The video evidence was damning, showing clearly that Patricia had intentionally blocked Thomas and refused multiple orders to move. Patricia eventually pleaded no contest to the harassment charge in exchange for the other charges being dropped. She was sentenced to 6 months probation, 100 hours of community service at a disability rights organization, mandatory anger management counseling, and had to pay restitution for the therapy Thomas needed after the incident. The community service at the disability rights organization was particularly fitting. Patricia would be required to work directly with people with disabilities, learning firsthand about the challenges they faced and the importance of accessibility and inclusion. The whole ordeal fundamentally changed Desert Springs Estates. The new HOA board under Linda Wu's leadership created a culture of inclusion and accessibility. They installed a pool lift that allowed people with mobility issues to safely enter and exit the water. They widened pathways throughout the community to ensure wheelchair access. They even created a sensory-friendly garden designed to be welcoming for residents with autism or sensory processing disorders. Thomas flourished in this new environment. He made friends with other kids in the neighborhood, spent countless hours at the pool during the summer, and became something of a local celebrity after the case made the news. Kids thought it was cool that he'd stood up for his rights, even though Thomas was quick to point out that his parents had done most of the heavy lifting. The case had a ripple effect beyond our community. Robert Chen and the Arizona Center for Disability Law used it as a teaching tool, presenting at conferences and training sessions for HOA managers and board members across the state. Arizona eventually passed legislation requiring all HOA board members to complete training on fair housing and disability law, directly inspired by our case. Other people with disabilities who'd faced discrimination from their HOAs reached out to us, sharing their stories. Some had been banned from using service animals. Others had been denied requests for accessible parking spaces or ramps. Our case gave them hope that they could fight back. A year after the verdict, we attended a pool party at Desert Springs Estates, celebrating the installation of new accessible features. The pool deck had been redesigned with smooth, wide pathways perfect for wheelchairs and walkers. The new pool lift gleamed in the Arizona sun. Signs throughout the facility proclaimed all welcome in English and Spanish. Thomas was in his element, racing his wheelchair along the deck and challenging other kids to races. His laughter echoed across the pool area, and I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. This was what we'd fought for. Not money, not revenge, but the simple right for our son to be included, to be welcome, to belong. Linda Wu found us during the party. "I want to apologize," she said quietly. "I voted with Patricia at first. I was scared of liability and conflict. I should have stood up for what was right from the beginning." "You voted against the policy at the meeting," Natalie reminded her. "After you'd already been fighting for weeks," Linda said. "I should have been an ally from day one. I'm sorry." "You're making up for it now," I said, gesturing at the transformed pool area. "This is incredible." "It's the least we could do," Linda said. "And honestly, it's made the whole community better. We've had 3 families with disabled members move in this year specifically because they heard about our accessibility features. Property values are actually up. That made me laugh. Patricia had been so obsessed with protecting property values that she'd cost the HOA hundreds of thousands of dollars and damaged the community's reputation. Meanwhile, doing the right thing had actually improved property values. We stayed in Desert Springs Estates for another 5 years. Thomas grew from an 8-year-old boy to a confident teenager who advocated for disability rights at his school and in the broader community. The pool incident became a defining moment in his life, not because of the discrimination he'd faced, but because of the way his family and community had rallied to make things right. Natalie and I eventually decided to move to a larger house in a different part of Phoenix when Thomas started high school. We wanted him to be in a specific school district with an exceptional adaptive sports program. Leaving Desert Springs Estates was bittersweet. Despite everything that had happened, it had become a true home. At our going-away party, organized by Linda and several neighbors who'd become close friends, people shared stories and memories. Several mentioned how the case had changed their perspective on disability and accessibility. One neighbor, a woman named Karen who'd initially sided with Patricia at that hostile HOA meeting, tearfully apologized for her past ignorance. Watching Thomas grow up here, seeing him as a real person and not just a policy issue taught me so much, Karen said. I'm ashamed of how I acted before, and I'm grateful you stayed and fought instead of just moving away. It was never about making people feel bad, Natalie said. It was about making sure Thomas had the same opportunities as every other kid. As we loaded the moving truck on our last day, Thomas took one final lap around the community in his wheelchair. He stopped at the pool, now quiet in the early morning, and looked at the accessible features that bore silent witness to our battle. "Dad," he said, "do you think what we did mattered?" "What do you think?" I asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I think it mattered to me, and maybe to other kids like me who won't have to fight the same fight." "Then it definitely mattered," I said. We heard later that Patricia had actually completed her community service, and according to the director of the disability rights organization where she'd worked, had shown genuine growth and remorse. She'd written us a letter of apology, which arrived a few months after we'd moved. The letter was thoughtful and humble, acknowledging the harm she'd caused and the wrongness of her actions. She didn't make excuses or minimize what she'd done. She simply apologized and expressed hope that Thomas was thriving. Natalie and I discussed whether to respond. We eventually sent a brief note thanking her for the apology and wishing her well. Forgiveness is complicated, especially when the harm was so deliberate and caused so much pain. But we also recognize that people can change, and Patricia seemed to be genuinely trying. The legal settlement money went into a trust fund for Thomas's future, earmarked for college and medical expenses. We also donated a portion to the Arizona Center for Disability Law to help other families facing similar battles. Looking back on everything that happened, I'm struck by how a simple summer day at the pool turned into a federal lawsuit and a community transformation. Thomas just wanted to swim. That basic desire, denied by prejudice and ignorance, sparked a chain of events that changed lives and set legal precedent. The case report, Donovan v. Desert Springs Estates HOA, is now cited in legal briefs and textbooks as a clear example of HOA liability for ADA violations. Law students study it. HOA managers use it as a cautionary tale. And somewhere in Phoenix, on hot summer days, kids swim in a pool that welcomes everyone, thanks to a battle we never wanted to fight but refused to lose. Thomas is 17 now, a junior in high school with dreams of becoming a disability rights attorney himself. He volunteers with advocacy organizations and speaks at schools about accessibility and inclusion. The wheelchair that caused so much controversy is just a part of who he is, no more remarkable than someone's height or hair color. Recently, Thomas gave a presentation at a local HOA conference, invited to share his perspective on disability and community living. He told the story of that day at the pool, of feeling unwelcome in his own neighborhood, and of watching his parents fight for his rights. He showed photos of the transformed Desert Springs Estates pool area, contrasting it with other inaccessible facilities. And he challenged the HOA board members in attendance to think about all their residents, including those with disabilities who might be invisible but still deserved inclusion. The presentation ended with a standing ovation. Afterward, several HOA representatives approached Thomas to ask for advice on making their communities more accessible. One man, a board president from Tucson, admitted that his HOA had recently denied a request for a wheelchair ramp, and that Thomas's story had made him realize the harm that decision might cause. "We're going to reverse that decision," the man said, "and we're going to do better." That ultimately is what the whole ordeal was about. Not the money, not the headlines, not even the legal victory, though all of those mattered. It was about creating a world where Thomas and kids like him don't have to fight just to swim in the pool. Where disability is accommodated as a matter of course, not grudgingly and only after litigation. Where HOAs see accessibility as a feature, not a burden. We never asked for any of this. We just wanted to swim in the pool. But sometimes the battles we don't choose become the ones that define us, and the stands we're forced to take become the legacy we leave behind. The wheelchair that Patricia Whitmore tried to ban from the pool area ended up costing the HOA $250,000, destroying a board president's reputation, and transforming an entire community's approach to inclusion. And somewhere in all of that, an 8-year-old boy learned that fighting for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it's scary, is always worth it. That lesson, more than anything else, was worth every difficult moment, every hostile meeting, every sleepless night worrying about legal bills and neighborhood drama. Thomas knows now, in a way that many people never learn, that his rights matter, that the law protects him, and that standing up to discrimination isn't just possible but necessary. And on summer days, when Thomas gets home from school and heads to the community pool in our new neighborhood, a place that welcomed him immediately and never questioned his right to be there, I think about how far we've come and how much further we still have to go. The fight for disability rights didn't end with our case. It continues every day in every community, wherever people with disabilities encounter barriers and exclusion. But because of what happened in Desert Springs Estates, because of a stubborn HOA president who refused to see reason and a family who refused to back down, at least one small corner of the world is better, more just, more welcoming. And that's something worth fighting for, every single time.